Well, hello and welcome to Bio 212, Anatomy and Physiology 2 at Norwalk Community College. And in this second presentation from chapter 29, what we're doing is we're picking up at neurulation. So we're finishing up the third week of development. And what I stressed when we finished the last presentation was that not only have we undergone gastrulation, which gave us 3 tissue types that will give rise to all other structures inside the body. You know now that you have endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. And the major event that happens as a result of that is we have neurulation, which is going to allow us now to build a nervous system that will be enclosed inside as the central nervous system, but also send out neural crest cells that will give rise to all of the other functioning parts of our nervous system. What does this actually mean? When we're actually looking at the development of a myotome, a dermatome, and a sclerotome, what we focus on inside class, of course, is that the dermatome is how we actually make connective tissues, namely your skin and all of that, that will have the nervous system within it. Inside class, I had you touch one single hair so you could feel that. And that was to illustrate that your body creates these regions that will collect pieces of information and will then send that into your nervous system. Should you then have to move, you're going to have the skeletal muscles of the neck, the trunk, and the limbs. The signal that will travel down from as an upper motor neuron to a lower motor neuron will then know exactly where to target. So the whole point, of course, is that you're developing unique regions with unique responsibilities, and that has to happen as a result of the production of these things that we call somites. Okay. What else is going to actually happen here? Well, we're going to make a cardiovascular system, and it's going to be the formation of blood vessels. And remember I told you that those blood vessels, we saw this inside our textbook when we're looking at the formation not only of blood vessels from around the choroid, but also inside the yolk sac. And what's going to happen, of course, is these blood islands will form, and then they actually move into what we're going to call, so you make a circulatory system throughout the entirety of the structure, right? And the structure being the developing fetus. And you now actually have to have a mechanism to move fluids around. So you end up, by the end of the third week, actually forming the cardiac muscle inside the tube, okay? And now that cardiac muscle will begin to actually push fluids through it. So how does it actually happen? Okay. Well, on the outside of the ball of cells that we know as a trophoblast, we'll have these chorionic villi. Okay. And they are projecting into that endometrium. And you know the endometrium here is the stratum functionalis and stratum basalis. But because we've digested in, you have to remind yourself that this is the decidua. Decidua. Okay. Fantastic. Now, over time, these blood vessels will become the umbilical cord, and it's important, and I know I've already said this, and I'm sure you already understand it, but maternal and fetal blood don't mix. So it's diffusion of materials through these now multiple layers. So the affinity actually has to be fairly high to get materials through there, meaning the metabolic need for oxygen or glucose or getting rid of carbon dioxide has to be, you have to create a steep enough gradient. So diffusion is the mechanism by which this all moves in there. And we saw that inside your textbook. I'm going to just move right down here, where we actually have, at least in this part of the cartoon, vasculature inside the yolk sac. For whatever reason, the artists didn't put it inside the developing fetus here, but you can see that we actually have our 2 arteries and 1 vein, and they're being fed by the vasculature that make up the chorionic villi. Okay, so you have these sort of like circular, because remember, this is in 360 degrees, it's surrounding the entire structure, and now we have materials moving from the yolk sac into the fetus, but also the diffusion of maternal materials into that fetal circulatory system. So ultimately what we end up doing is we end up forming the placenta. And in class I didn't stress, what week this actually happens, but there's definitely a fetal portion, okay, which was made by the chorionic villi, and there's a maternal portion that formed from the decidua basalis. Okay, so that's the interface is the important part, right? And I know I did mention that the only time that this would actually become interrupted would be after a trauma, right? So, and that's not always a good thing. In fact, I would say it's not a good thing because the repair of that would actually reduce the amount of materials that actually transmit through. Obviously, this is the fourth or fifth time now we've stressed how many arteries are actually present. Whoops, let's fix that. Control Z. Let's do this instead. And one vein. And notice that they are not working the way you expect them to. So this means that this is a portal system. Okay? And obviously, after birth, the placenta will detach and be actually removed from the uterus itself. And that's what it actually looks like here. So this is the chorionic villi that will develop into a placenta. And notice this actually has a circular aspect to it. That represents the amount of surface area that's attached to the uterus. All of those arteries and veins now collecting, sending into two arteries and one vein that will travel now into the fetus here. Okay. Obviously, organs are going to start forming inside the body. What you want to make sure you understand here is that, of course, you're just getting bigger, okay? And I don't mean you physically, but maybe once upon a time you inside of the actual amniotic cavity where you were developing. As I said in class, I have no desire for you to sit back and try and memorize the contents of table 29.2. But it's, depending on what type of medicine you're going into, it's an interesting read. By that I mean, these are the characteristics of an average of all potential fetal developmental rates and what changes you would expect to see. Okay? But beyond that, really what we want to focus on inside this class are what are the mechanisms by which all of this happens, which means we're going to focus on the maternal changes during pregnancy. So if the first part of chapter 29 was, hey, we have a fetus, we have to build an environment for that to happen. Now we want to think about the hormones that are actually regulating that, okay? And I'm assuming that you still understand that the corpus luteum inside the now expelled follicle, meaning the secondary oocyte has ovulated out of the follicle, the follicular structure. We now have the corpus luteum. And because pregnancy has occurred, the corpus luteum continued to produce hormones. And the major hormones that regulate phenotypic change inside the body will be the estrogens and progesterone. Okay? As this happens, what's going to, so we're going to make some HCG. What's going to happen is that HCG is going to maintain that corpus luteum. So the way I usually try to make sure people pay attention to this, right, is that the chorion is making HCG to ensure that the corpus luteum stays functioning. And at some point in time, there won't be a need for the corpus luteum, but that's going to be some months off yet. Simultaneously, the relaxin that's being made by the corpus luteum and the placenta will increase that pubic symphysis, okay, that we spoke about in class yesterday, I believe. Okay, so what else do we need to think about? Well, there's some new hormones, and remember, this is where I'm going to pause and say, no matter how you figure out a way to learn all these hormones, remember you're continually adding to the list of hormones you're encountering. So here we actually have human chorionic somatomammotropin. It can also be called human placental lactogen, okay, which is going to be produced by the chorion. It's going to prepare the mammary glands for lactation. Okay, so this means we use the circulatory system to develop the HCS that travels to the mammary tissue that allows for it to increase the maternal metabolism so that the mammary glands are ready when birth occurs. So how does it know when to be ready for? Well, that's corticotropin releasing hormones responsibility. And in class, I made a big deal out of the fact that, look, we're making a releasing hormone inside the placenta. And remember, I made the statement that you actually have created essentially hypothalamic responsibilities inside the placenta. And that's actually true because it's normally only secreted from the hypothalamus. But what's going to happen is the corticotrophic releasing hormone will drive, okay, the production of surfactant. We don't need to know what that is just yet, but it makes the fetal lungs capable of functioning at birth, okay? So without all of the increased cortisol inside the bloodstream, none of this is going to happen. And I know we stressed that, so I'm kind of hoping this is sort of resonating inside your ears. Okay, so what does it actually look like? Assuming that you understand that this is the placenta here now, which means we've developed enough so that we've moved beyond, say, chorion structure. You now have a placenta, and the placenta is attached by an umbilical cord to the fetus. You're going to see that these different hormones are being made. And what I want to make sure that you actually see here is that all you really have is a list of the materials that are being made. Assume that they're being transported into the circulatory system, and therefore they're going to have multiple effects throughout the developing mother as well as the fetus. And this is what you can see from just before fertilization. So it's day 0 here, roughly day 3, day 4, a spike in human chorionic gonadotropin, and then around 32, 36, another elevation of it. But the point that I want to stress is that progesterone from the corpus luteum and then being made primarily from the actual uterus itself, you're now going to see the concentration shift. And this is really how Mother Nature knows when birth should happen, when you actually have more estrogens than you do progesterone inside the circulatory system. What else is actually happening? Okay, you're going to see physical changes, weight gain due to the fetus, the amniotic fluids that are being stored, increased storage. And that amniotic fluid, let's put a bracket here. Okay, what's its purpose? Well, it's insulation. It's also trauma protection. So it acts as not just insulation for warmth and all of that, but also, imagine if you will, it acts as a shock absorber. Okay. The mother will also begin to store proteins, triglycerides, and minerals, okay, with a marked enlargement of your breasts. Obviously, these are the tissues that are now actually being able to make the material that will be, if needed, be shared with the developing child after birth, okay? So what is labor? Okay, labor, of course, is the process by which we expel the fetus from the uterus through the vagina. The level of estrogen must rise to overcome the inhibiting effects of progesterone on uterine contraction. So now I know I haven't said it this way before, so now I want to make sure you get the idea that the hormones inside the bloodstream are competing with one another, meaning estrogen and progesterone were competing. They weren't just driving metabolism and all of that. Progesterone was stopping uterine contractions, and now you have more estrogen, so therefore the estrogens now increase the number of oxytocin receptors, and therefore they can now respond to the increasing concentration of oxytocin. Okay? As long as, let's go back to this, as long as the head is actually stretching the cervix, more oxytocin will actually be made. More oxytocin, more stretching. It only stops after the head. The next widest part, of course, is the shoulders, but then after that, everything is tapered. So there's not as much stretching, so there's not as much need for smooth muscle contraction, right? So in here you can see the stage of dilation where you actually have the head cresting, crowning, if you will, actually traveling out. And then finally, after birth, you actually have the removal of the placenta itself. Okay? As I've stressed multiple times now, you should pay attention to the fact that the fetal lungs have been collapsed. They have amniotic fluid inside of it, and the rising levels of carbon dioxide, okay, are going to create stress, and it's being monitored inside the medulla, okay, which is why we learned about all of the cranial nerves inside chapter 18, where you're measuring the amount of carbon dioxide, and that's what actually causes the vigorous exhalation, okay, and crying. Closure of the foramen ovale, okay, is now going to allow for the blood to travel to the lungs, okay, so that you end up with this structure that's called the fossa ovalis, okay, and then the other structures that allowed for the portal system to function inside the fetus are now closed, okay. Moving on to the physiology of lactation here, what we can see is that milk has to come from the mammary glands. And the major hormone that's responsible for this is, of course, prolactin. And what it's going to do is, once secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, it's going to actually cause the metabolism to increase. But notice something here. Progesterone, which we saw was higher than estrogen for the longest period of time, inhibits the effects of prolactin. So now that we actually have changed the concentration of estrogen and prolactin, once the inhibition has been removed, estrogen and is now going to drive all of the reactions. Okay, so how does it actually happen? By reactions, I mean the next level of regulation. The principal stimulus for maintaining prolactin secretion is actually the sucking action of the infant. I called it buccal action, B-U-C-A-L, right? Buccal action, or I do call it buccal action. Okay, and the stretch receptors release prolactin and decrease the release. Notice this here, so it's a sort of negative, it's a negative feedback system, okay? Decrease the release of an inhibiting hormone, and therefore it increases the release of releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. What this means is the normal state of female physiology is that you have an overriding inhibitory system in place until such times as there's a physical need through changes in pressure, okay, at the actual nipple itself that actually cause the reversal from PIH to PRH. And it's a reflex. Okay, so the oxytocin that was used at birth also causes milk ejection, and this can be brought about by the actual suckling reaction. You can actually hear a baby cry, okay? And what's going to happen, of course, is you actually have smooth muscle contraction. The presence of myoepithelium is what allows for the contraction to happen and now let milk down. Colostrum is, of course, the first thing that's let down. The true appearance of milk actually doesn't happen until like the 4th day of milk let down. And what's important here is the antibodies that are inside of it. Okay, and those antibodies will be the first mechanism that will aid in the development of the immune system inside of the now newborn. Okay? Yay. Okay, so this is a good place for us to actually stop for the maternal differences. And what I'd like to do is then begin with inheritance with the next presentation. So let's just sort of give one big overview here. So the first set of slides was fertilization to neurulation, which means implantation had occurred, which means you went from epiblast to hypoblast, and then you have ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And then in this series, what we did is we got from developing fetal structures, we put in some vascularization, we built a placenta, and then we paid attention to the maternal changes. And what I mean by that is you're paying attention to the hormonal regulation that allowed for the completion of gestation. Once gestation ended, parturition occurred, birth occurred, and now we actually have to think about how it is you keep the infant alive using the milk ejection reflex as a result of the removal of prolactin inhibiting hormone by changing the concentration of progesterone. Okay.